thank you, Hisham, for having us. Thank you to the program on Arab Reform and Democracy and the Abbasi program in Islamic Studies. It's really a delight to be here. Those of us following Algeria have been often at home, kind of in front of Twitter and Facebook and on the phone and on Skype with nobody to really talk to, so it's really wonderful to be in a room with people and get to share some of my excitement about what's happened the last few months. Having said that, I am a historian, so I'm going to take us back a little bit, and then I will hand over the talk to Thomas, who will do the more contemporary period. But I do want to start with thinking about some of the pitfalls about the term Arab Spring applied to Algeria. And I'm going to kind of make an argument that if we apply that discourse to what's happening in Algeria, we risk sanitizing the revolution, and we will actually miss some of the claims and the mobilizations that are happening on the ground. The need for peaceful dialogue is, of course, important, but there are some other claims that people are making. And the notion of a spring itself comes out of course, first the 19th century, but I won't take you that far back, I promise. I'm a historian, but I know my audience a bit. But of course, the Prague Spring and the notion that there was going to be a liberalization opening after communist authoritarian rule. And that's really not what's happening in Algeria, I think. And so third worldism, I think, also has gotten a bit of a bad rap. It's something utopian, it's slightly outdated. We know now didn't work out. But some of the claims and languages and vocabularies being used are actually quite mysterious unless we take third worldism as a language seriously. And I also promised to have some slides from the protests and some slogans to work with. So hopefully that will make the historical part a little bit more bearable. Just as a quick footnote, it's really important to point out that Algeria was not actually a colony, right? So we talk about colonial Algeria, but Algeria was 3 French departments. It was an integral part of France. When people are watching Brexit, and I like to joke that, maybe Theresa May could have taken a cue from Ben Bella, who exited from the European Union in a much less complicated fashion. But when Algeria got independence in 1962, Algeria was part of the then European Economic Community. So we're not actually talking about something that was outside of France, but something that was internal. And why is that important for today? Thinking about, for example, language policies. Thinking about how completely destroyed socially and economically Algeria was on the eve of independence is really vital. So in Algeria, unlike Morocco and Tunisia, the Arabic language was all but destroyed. And the only place that it survived was in kind of religious establishments or madrasas. And so the ways in which you have really a kind of battle between Fusha, modern standard Arabic, which has been a force of cultural imperialism in Algeria. Just as an anecdote, when I first went to Algeria in 2006, I had been living in Damascus and I had learned Syrian Arabic, and I showed up, and the Algerian family that was very generously hosting me, the kids would say, "Your Arabic is amazing, can you teach us your Arabic?" Of course, I'm a foreigner, I speak Arabic with an accent, but the fact that they looked up to my Arabic as something to aspire to tells us a lot. But that is starting to change, and one of the really beautiful things, I've been watching this also, for full disclosure, from a distance. I spent a lot of time in Algeria between 2006 and 2014, but have not had a visa to go back since. So, just for full disclosure, this is not fresh in terms of my experience in Algeria, unfortunately. But one of the things that's been fun watching this from abroad is hashtags that are about Darija, about sayings in Darija that are untranslatable. There's an amazing clip that went viral of a young man kind of telling off, really, a reporter on the streets of Algiers who's telling him, speak Arabic, and he says to her, this is our Arabic. If you want to be in Algiers and talk about Algerian people, stop telling me to speak Fusha, basically. So that is, I think, something very important about what's happening. And of course, the cliche that Algerians are illiterate in 3 languages, a very disparaging way to talk about what's actually a very rich linguistic landscape. Some of the things that have gotten picked up, the verb vendrediser, right, to do Friday, literally, which means to go out and protest, and they have been doing so every Friday since February 22nd. It's absolutely, the longevity of this movement is just really, really amazing. But another legacy of the War of Independence and the nationalist movement, and some of these tensions, I think, are problems and kind of complications that Hirak, the movement, is going to have to deal with going forward. One of them is about what is Algerian identity? And because of the destruction of Algeria so thoroughly under the French, even later on nationalists like Farhat Abbas said, I've studied the history books. I have not been able to find an Algerian nation. If I had found one, I would go out and fight for one. But as far as history goes, one doesn't exist. So imagine, he will become a nationalist leader years later. But imagine, the violence of a nationalist leader saying that prior to that moment, just to give you an idea of how fraught the project of Algerian nationalism was. The FLN itself, who, we're seeing it's a kind of a big question mark about what will happen to the FLN and its historical legitimacy as the party that won independence from France, was always balanced between kind of at least three different ideological strands. Right, on the one hand, a history of kind of Islamic jihadi millenarial movements that were often, local networks that saw the war as a jihad against France in religious terms. Kind of a more socialist, secularist strand that had been also, really important in France. Massaly Haj, one of those leaders, had come up in the French Communist Party working with North African workers in France in the factories. So that was also a language available to the Algerians. And of course, I'll talk a little bit about the question about Berber identity and what that is going to mean going forward. But from the start, they were juggling a lot of different strands of identity. And trying to coalesce it into this third world mold. So perhaps thinking about what is third worldism, if I'm going to insist that it's important we understand it. Here you have, when you walk by downtown near the Grand Poste at Alger, the Liberation Monument, and you see, the two fists kind of trying to break its chains. It's a very Fanonian image. And so I would say that third worldism has the notion that the will of the people is a historical actor. The notion that conscious struggle, a unitary conscious struggle, is constitutive of the nation. And it's different from a Marxist ideology, right? Marx would have talked about class struggle. In Algeria, what we're seeing over and over again is not about class, it's about the people. And that's really an important image for third worldism. And here you see one of the slogans of the Algerian Revolution that's been popping up all over the place, along with stencils of Allez la Pointe. I know there was an event here about the Battle of Algiers, and so there have been slogans in the streets about Allez la Pointe still being alive and well, and so this is very much part and parcel of what's happening. There's also an economic aspect to this. Here is, a poster that was unfurled, and it says on the sword, it says to the magnificence of the people, and you see a kind of Algerian warrior slaying a neo-colonial octopus, and at the bottom you see that the blood of the martyrs is the fuel of the movement. And so this is, again, a kind of third worldist image that we shouldn't take as an incitement to violence. I think that it's important to point out that the movement has been very clear that it's a peaceful movement, that the lessons of the Civil War have been learned. They've been very prudent about how to make sure that there's no conflicts with the police, for example. And yet, you see things, also the Palestinian flag. It's almost impossible in the last few weeks to look at pictures of what's happening on the streets and not see a Palestinian flag. And of course, people had kind of given up on Algerian third worldism for a while, that maybe their vocation was not going to be one of international solidarity. And we shouldn't forget that Bouteflika, who we now, of course, think of as this kind of decrepit zombie figure in a wheelchair, was, of course, part of the FLN. He did fight for independence. And not only that, but when he was the president of the UN General Assembly in 1974, he's the one who brought Yasser Arafat to come and give the historical speech about the olive branch and the gun. So the roots between Bouteflika's Algeria, Palestine, and third worldism run quite deep, even if they have been harder to see in recent years. So my point here is I think it would be a mistake to think about what's happening only in terms of the War of Independence, but as scholars do, that's my expertise, so I'm going to read a lot into that. But at the same time, I don't think we can ignore it completely. struggles. I mentioned Masali Haj earlier, and that has been a chapter in Algerian history that really has not been excavated. The FLN, the dominant nationalist party, engaged in a really kind of violent purge of Masali Haj supporters during the War of Independence. And that's something that has started to be talked about, but has not been part of the kind of nationalist narrative. I was interested to see that Masali Haj's daughter was actually in Montreal protesting with Hirak a few weeks ago. There's also a question about what is the FLN and when did it begin? And so I mentioned questions about Berber identity, and to also just make the remark that the kind of Berberist insurgency against the state was not just about national identity. It really was one of the first claims that kind of rubbed up against this single party unanimous idea of what national sovereignty looked like. And so here you see a tombstone marker for the FLN saying that it was born in 1963 and has perhaps passed away in 2019. Of course, if you're reading a textbook history of the Algerian War, the FLN is not born in 1963. The FLN has fought a war of independence much before then. So here we see kind of a contested memory from, I don't know, I would imagine this was maybe somebody from the FFS or from somebody who has a legacy of opposing the Algerian state. And there was Ait Ahmed led an insurgency against the FLN from 1962 to 1963. And many of the FFS supporters and militants have been really, have been very active in what's been happening in the last few months. Here's another banner that's been seen that kind of pays homage to the Berber Spring in 1980, which was one of the first kind of openings up to think about the FLN and the one-party state, as well as the Black Spring of 2001, which was a very harsh crackdown on this tendency. And so many of the slogans, again, pouvoir assassin, that the state is a kind of, that the power of the state is actually an assassin, became well known, that particular slogan, at the funeral of Lounis Matoub, who was a singer and a Berber militant who was assassinated in 1998. And like many things in Algerian history, there are disputes about who killed him, and a lot of the most key episodes in Algerian history, you can think about the assassination of Boudiaf, for example. We don't actually know who to blame in that. And so that's also been a question that has, I think, haunted some of the desire for justice and for closure about the past. And France, of course, has played a big role, not only in some of the Berberist movements, but in general in terms of militant activist networks that really span Algeria and France. And it's, I think, interesting to point out that legally, it was not France, but Algeria that stopped immigration between France and Algeria. Boumediene in 1973 was the one who actually first stopped immigration for Algerians going to France. And this has been kind of a common trope in a lot of Algerian humor and life, is feeling, that one cannot leave Algeria, that the visa process for Algerians is so Kafkaesque that it's nearly impossible. And so here you see some of the cartoons, about how difficult it is to get a visa. So on the right, somebody who's gone to drop off their dossier for a visa and says on the phone, the line's going to cut, I'm about to enter into this dark, horrible tunnel, and that tunnel is, of course, the window where the officer, the guichet for the visa. And so there was always this notion that Algerians couldn't get out and wanted to. And another kind of symbol that's come back recently is the notion that Algerians want to stay rather than cross the Mediterranean. And I know a lot of friends who are Franco-Algerian who've come back to Algeria for the movement, who've wanted to be there and reconstruct a movement. And there again, we see kind of, I think, a transition from notions of human capital, the notion that if you have human capital, you are valuable to transnational circuits of capital, to a more third worldist notion that national subjects can stay in order to make the country itself valuable. It's a very different kind of conjugation about what it means to add worth to a project and what that project is. And for me, as a historian of the 1960s in Algeria, it really resonates with a lot of the discourse that Ben Bella had about cooperation, about people coming to Algeria to construct something that was radically different from colonialism. And so there again, I think we see some of these tropes of the revolution that are coming back. And some of the tropes of the revolution, one thought, whether that was the kind of revolution. Here you have the mujahida kind of telling off a policeman. And then recently, the number 2 leader of the FIS, Abbasi Madani, who passed away a few weeks ago in his funeral that took place in Algiers. And in both of these moments, you had this notion of, that what had thought to be over, what Bouteflika had declared to be part of the amnesty arrangements in 1999 and 2005, the book had been shut. And I think what we're seeing is public space being a way to show that the book is not shut, and some of those pages are still actually being worked out on the streets. So, to finish, I think that I started by saying the kind of trope of national reconciliation and the Arab Spring is not going to, I think, solve some of these issues. And so the question about using this moment to think about kind of a more conflictual and more historically based kind of redressement of some of the injustices that Algerians have felt, rather than just saying the most important thing is to get some good interlocutors to hold hands and form a coalition right away, is to me how third worldism is still resonating on the streets of Algiers. But I'll turn it over to somebody who knows much more about contemporary Algerian politics and will take us out of history and into the present. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Muriam. I would like also to thank the Programme for Arab Reform and Democracy, the Abbasi Programme for Islamic Studies, and obviously Hisham Salam for inviting us and introducing us in such a comprehensive fashion. There is one thing that I never do when I write about Algeria, is talk about democracy. I consider that democracy from an analytical perspective is not the best category to think about the Middle East, in general to think about political systems, but democracy is an operational category if we want to think about the normative discourses that are produced and also a set of practices, of techniques of power. And since we are here at Stanford and invited by the Programme for Arab Reform and Democracy, I thought that it would be interesting to think about democracy in Algeria, to think about democracy as a normative discourse and democratization as a practice. And see how democratization in Algeria historically has trumped democracy, and see how the failure of democratization or the various practices associated with democratization led to the current movement. So this is what I'm going to do today. Obviously, when thinking about the Hirak right now in Algeria, there are so many potential entries, and I feel that we can speak about the socio-economic dimension of the political crisis, we can speak about the regime, we can speak about the role of the civil war. All of this is relevant. I'm just focusing on the question of democracy and democratization because, I mean, it's good to focus on something when you have a talk, and then in the discussion we can look at the rest of the problem. I'm not going to speak about the theory, but let's say that from a normative perspective, the debates are still going on, and there is no consensus among political philosophers or political scientists when it comes to the meaning of what is a democratic regime. Is it aggregative? Is it deliberative? Is it radical? Is it agonistic? And when it comes to democratization, well, after this period of hegemony in the 90s, obviously the approach has been heavily criticized, especially by scholars working on the Middle East, who have emphasized at least two alternative ways to think about the process: the idea of authoritarian upgrading and the idea of hybridization of political systems. This being said, let's go back to something that is real, that is to say Algeria. I want to start with something very simple, something that must be said because it's a misconception that is in a way violence made to the Algerian people. This is not an awakening. The Algerian people has been protesting, demonstrating, rioting in so many ways for the last 15 years. Therefore, what we see right now is a continuation of this movement of protest, and it is, and this is what makes it interesting, it is a coming together. And usually when people come together like that, it's because there is an occasion. What is this occasion? The presidential election. So we see that the question of the democratic procedures is relevant from the beginning. If we move back in time, we look at what happened for what many Algerians consider to be the first Arab Spring, even if they won't use the word Arab Spring because they resent it for obvious reasons. And they will say we had our revolution in 1988, and it's true that in 1988, a massive movement of protest swept the country. The regime reacted brutally, sent the troops, a curfew was declared, and more than 500 persons died. 500 people died. After this moment, this uprising, the regime adopted a new constitution in 1989, started a process of political and media opening, which resulted, as you may know, simply with the rise of the Islamic Salvation Front, which dominated the political field in a way that was apparently not planned by the regime. The Islamic Salvation Front won 2 elections in a row, the local elections in 1990 and the first round of the legislative elections in 1991. And here comes our first question. What is the meaning of democracy? In January 1992, you have a coup in Algeria, military coup. And clearly those who defend this coup, whether they are Algerians or in Europe, member of the EU, French politicians associated with the Algerian regime will say, well, we supported the coup. Why? Because it was a coup against a non-loyal political party. It was about saving democracy. Look at Ali Belhaj, who said, "Democratia kufr." Okay, that's the first version. And then the other version, widespread in Algeria, in Europe, in France also, which says, well, precisely, you have an election, they won the election fair and square, they were absolutely legalist in their approach because, let me remind you that those running the feast in late 1991, early 1992, were the Jazara, the intellectual elite, who were resolutely non-violent and legalist. And their leader was Abdelkader Hachani, who repeated again and again, we want to negotiate, we don't want violence. Why? For an obvious reason. We are going to win. We have no reason to want violence. So, 2 versions of what is democracy here. Should we respect all the electoral processes? Or should we just prioritize pro-liberal parties? Which is what it means. And then the civil war started. I'm not going to go over the civil war. You know that it led to, it caused the death of more than 150,000 Algerians. But in 1995, you have the first presidential election after the coup, won by Yamin Zerwal, and you have a progressive normalization of the electoral process with the election of Abdelaziz Bouteflika in 1999, and finally, you have a succession of electoral processes, a resolutely pluralist partisan or political field, and the only thing that happens is that the successive polls result in a never-ending status quo, a never-ending transition, a never-ending consolidation, in the words of the regime. This is time for transition and then consolidation. So they appropriate the narrative of democratization, but they focus on one specific moment, which is consolidation, the last stage, when it's about being loyal, voting, and respecting the law. Perfect for them. It's perfect. Consequently, in Algeria, critics of the regime have said, have presented Algeria's Bouteflika as a democracy de façade, a cosmetic democracy. Well, the problem with the notion of democracy de façade is that it expresses clearly, accurately, the widespread feeling among the population that this is just a joke, that voting doesn't make sense, that what we say is not taken into account by the regime, and that the people who allegedly represent us are a bunch of thieves, jokers, and also relatively stupid. And this is not acceptable for the Algerians. So, you see, they reject that. They say this representation is not a representation, this is facade, this is cosmetic, but this is not us. So there is a clear break here. Representation is not happening. But saying that this is just merely a facade, this is just merely cosmetic, overlooks the fact that you have pluralist elections, that in Algeria, the police in the 2000s evolved. In the 1990s, coercion, policing was militarized, extremely violent, opposing the regime, meant that you might disappear rapidly. In the 2000s, the regime prioritized what they called the democratic management of the masses, based on la gestion démocratique des foules, promoted by the French state. So they appropriated a new form of coercion. So concretely, the power structure evolved. It's a narrative of authoritarian upgrading. And this authoritarian upgrading opened space for dissent, for constant rioting, for a succession of strikes, the constitution of a new landscape of trade unions, which challenged the regime constantly. So there was a real domestic pressure and a real critical discourse in Algeria under Bouteflika. Happens 2011. 2011 is interesting because it's the Arab Spring and the regime has to revive the narrative of democratization to show that, it was not really consolidation, no, we are going to do it again. So you have a new series of reforms, you have an opening of the TV, a new law on associations, they legalize also a set of political parties, which means that at this point in Algeria, you have more than 70 political parties. So talking about pluralism, pluralism at a point where it becomes absurd. And the absurdity of this kind of market, of electoral market, is the point. And here come, obviously, the Europeans. The Europeans want the transition to succeed in Algeria because they don't want a revolution in Algeria, they don't want a civil war in Algeria. What they want is a nice democratic country, a liberal representative country with which they can do business. And they send this electoral observation mission, or this election observation mission, whose goal is to monitor the 2012 legislative elections organized by the regime. And at this point, the regime has a narrative which is pretty clear. On one hand, you have the Arab winters, or the so-called spring of graveyards, as they say it without any kind of subtlety. And you have Algeria, which is our spring. Our spring. And what it is to support Algeria, the Algerian spring, it is to vote. You have to vote, you have to participate. And the Europeans participate in this staging of democratization, but they come with another approach. When the regime focuses on consolidation in a very bureaucratic manner, because in Algeria the theory of democracy produced by the state is unanimist, vertical, bureaucratic, nationalist. Well, the theory of democracy promoted by, or the theory of democratization, promoted by the Europeans is incremental, technocratic. So it's step by step, and we are going to create this market of democracy in a purely technical fashion. Obviously, they failed big time. They faced the backslash from political parties in Algeria, from the regime. They were accused of trying to vassalize Algeria. So they went back on the other side of the Mediterranean. What matters here is that the regime didn't stop. They are not going to stop their electoral processes. So you have this succession of electoral process that keep going for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years more. And it becomes increasingly absurd. Increasingly absurd. One of the two pictures here is false. Which one is it? Well, I'm going to tell you, this is this one. Because I mean, if you vote for the ARD, you'll get some yogurt. This one is for real. He's actually playing the ninja on his poster. This is the kind of representation that was offered to the Algerian people for more than a decade. And this, in a way, is unbearable. I live with a lot of young Americans, most of them from like a democratic background, and they resent and they feel shame given their current leadership. As a Frenchman under Sarkozy, I felt shame. An Algerian, for the last 6 years, has been represented by this old man, unable to speak, unable to move. When he was elected for a fourth term, re-elected for a fourth term in 2014, he was unable to swear his oath. So you can feel the shame, you can feel the humiliation here. And at one point, we come back to a little bit of political theory in a Tillian term. If you think about social movements. The 2019 presidential election is an occasion for the Algerian people to come together, because it is a public humiliation of the polity as a whole. Everybody is humiliated. Which doesn't mean, again, that there wasn't some kind of underlying activism before. If we look at the period from 2011 to 2019, this constant movement of social unrest led to a reconfiguration of the Algerian repertoire of contention, of all the strategies available for expressing dissent in the streets. Before that, because of the fragmentation inherited from the civil war, rioting was the dominant way to express anger in Algeria. But after 2011, given the transformation of the police state, given the fact that this democratic management of the masses focused heavily on anti-rioting, on anti-riot units, which is a French specialty. Well, Algerian protesters changed the way in which they thought about the public space, they thought about the confrontation with the regime, and, focused on three very simple ideas. Pacifism, patriotism, all the time, expressing both your pacifism and your patriotism, and a self-organization in order to occupy the public space without ever provoking a reaction from the police. And this is something that you can see from 2011 onwards, especially in the south, especially with the movement of the unemployed, led, among others, by this man, Tahar Belabès. But the cost of that is that Algerians have systematically avoided politics. Why? Because politics were the place where this guy ruled, and these guys were competing for power. Politics were a place where the Khobsists, the Shiatin, the sellout, the Harki, the Eradicateur, all the bad names in Algeria's, in Bouteflika's Algeria, were living their life. So, expressing dissent, expressing a radical rejection of the regime meant that you were in contact with political activists, but never officially attached to a political party. It was a condition sine qua non. And here comes the revolution. Here comes the revolution, and we revert to another idea of democracy, which is third worldist, inherently, and which is not in many ways compatible with the way in which democracy has been promoted by the democratization machine, by the democracy makers around the world. Why? Because it's un seul héros, le peuple. This is not about pluralism. democracy in a revolution, democracy for the Algerians, is radical, democracy is third-worldist, democracy is unanimist. And this unanimism is the only way, oh no, it's only my laptop with freezing, so it's fine. Democracy, I'm just going to do that. So, democracy, as it is central in the revendication of the movement right now, is inherently tied to an ideal of political sanctity. And this ideal of political sanctity, only the people can embody it. Only the people as a class in struggle, as a class that is defying a system, only the people as an actor freed from representation, freed from the burden of delegation, can embody the ideal of political sanctity. Because we all know here that a representative, somebody who is elected, has to be at one point pragmatic. There is no place for political sanctity in mundane representative politics. Or you get shot, I guess. So what we have right now happening in Algeria is an exercise in radical democratic politics. And two aspects are, I feel, pretty relevant. You have this idea that it's a conscious attempt of self-representation without any delegate, without any established leader, without any kind of strategic orientation coming from political parties. Self-representation, a staging of what the people really is. Because for the last 15 years, if you have been to Algeria, you know very well that the Algerian people has been constantly portrayed as a bunch of shepherds, as a bunch of pre-modern, violent people who, if they ever benefit from freedom, will end up killing each other. And this is what these people are doing. They are saying, no. This was the fake representation of the fake democratization. This is what we are for real. This is the real power of the people. But this real power of the people has to be unanimist, and it has to be purely antagonistic and dichotomous. It only exists against the Isaba, against the gang, against all those who are supporting the fifth mandate. Yahya, Selal, Said, Haddad, and the jokers here. I'm not going to indulge with quoting the name. They don't deserve it. This means that, obviously, this cannot exist in the long run. It's not something that can be institutionalized. The problem is that when it comes to the institutionalization of the alternative to Bouteflika's rule, well, those in charge are still members of the regime. They are still either bureaucrats, technocrats, or politicians appointed by Bouteflika, such as obviously Ben Salah, the current interim president, or they are members of the military bureaucratic or the security apparatuses, such as, in that case, Ahmed Gaid Salah, who is the most powerful man in Algeria right now. And right now, Gaid Salah is speaking about democracy, he's speaking about civilization a lot. He's speaking about a good transition, what should be a good transition, and how to reorganize the plurality. And he is pushing for two things, three things actually. You have the elections, officially scheduled for July 4th. You have a parody of economic justice that targets only a handful of affairistes, of businessmen attached or linked to Bouteflika, while we all know that corruption in Algeria is systemic and structural, and that the army benefits from it, even. And finally, he pushes for a national dialogue in order to allow, if you want, a reordering and a disciplining of the polity by, obviously, allocating some positions to the members of this discipline plurality. In conclusion, what is happening right now in Algeria is something described by Pierre Bourdieu in his work on the language of politics. And he says that one of the things that results from representation is the need to revolt. It's the need for a rebellion against the tyranny of the political clergy. And this is what the protesters have done over the last 3 months. But they face the limit of their grassroots movement because it is almost impossible for them to go beyond the antagonistic dichotomous discourse and to promote some kind of platform, some kind of coherent strategy that could actually pose the regime. So some well-known figures in Algeria are trying constantly to come up with a platform, with a list of 18 points, with a way to somehow have a coherent plan. For example, the last one who tried it were these 3 men: Rachid Ben Yales, former head of the Algerian Navy; Ahmed Taleb Ibrahimi, figure of the national movement and Islamo-friendly, which is a plus, and Ali Yahya Abdel-Nour, the figure of human rights in Algeria. But they come up with a platform, and this platform cannot meet, if you want, the standards of political sanctity that are inherent to this form of radical democratic movement. And in front of that, you have the regime that is pushing for some kind of reordering. Gaid Salah wants us to go back to the temporality of democratization, which is disciplinary, which is a way to tame the people, tame the Algerian people. And taming the Algerian people is not an easy thing. So, what comes next? It is likely that at one point democratization will trump democracy once again. It is likely. But we can, and this is a very pessimistic way to look at it. And we can also look at it from a different perspective and come back to Bourdieu, who says that in order to promote emancipation, you need to accept a tiny bit of alienation. You need to accept a tiny bit of representation. And this is where the Algerian movement, the Algerian Hirak is right now. Can they accept a little dose of representation in order to challenge the regime and, propose their own understanding of what would be a decent form of transition? Thank you.